Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Gaslit Truth Podcast. Before we start, Terry and I have something that we just need to share with the world because it's so very cool. And I have to give Terry credit for this because she got me a little Christmas gift that came in the mail.
Sure did.
And I fucking love it. So for those of you on YouTube,
There
check
you go.
out our
You can see it on
chest.
Instagram.
Look at this.
Personally
And
victimized
Insta.
by my neurotransmitters on my shirt.
Great. I mean, you're
Yes.
talking to two brain health gurus, so this is fucking funny to us. You may not think it's funny.
My
But
husband didn't get it. He's like, I don't
I know, mine
understand your
didn't either.
shirt.
I
I'm
know
like,
he's an idiot. And I did post this on Instagram, and I wore this Christmas. This was
Yeah.
my Christmas shirt that I wore. I mean, I wore a nice little jacket over it, but I mean, and it's funny because only like 3 people out of like the 50 I saw on Christmas say something to me, and I'm like, okay, you guys don't have any sense of humor. Like, I'll put on the tacky Christmas sweater because that's funnier. Yeah. So
Anyway, Jen and I are
yes,
personally victimized by our neurotransmitters.
we are victimized by our neurotransmitters. So if anybody is out there that understands this, thinks it's funny, is in that
Let
in
us
that same
know.
space, can you please drop us a DM? That would be great because we'll give you a high five on that all day long. So thanks for the Christmas gift, Terry. That's
You're
very
very
sweet of you.
welcome.
Appreciate that.
All right.
All right. So now we get to the fun stuff, right? So everybody, here's the deal today. You've got to stop self-sabotaging because you are gaslighting yourself. And here we are. We are your whistleblowing shrinks, Dr. Teralyn and Therapist Jenn, and we are the Gaslit Truth Podcast.
All right, we're going to welcome our special guest to the show. And I actually did all the technology correctly. So 2025 is looking pretty smart for me at this point.
You toggled accurately.
I toggled and did the thing, and I talked at the same time. So if you want to see it, go to YouTube. Yeah, I'm getting good. How
many degrees it took? She can toggle.
Too many. All right, we're going to welcome Crystle Lampitt to the show. Crystle is a licensed psychotherapist, speaker, and trauma specialist. Her passion is helping others who feel stuck in survival mode to find a greater sense of alignment and self-trust. I like that. As a multiracial transplant with her own ADHD diagnosed late in life, she has a special interest in working with multi-ethnic identity adoptees. We're going to talk about this, and not parent expected cases or biological discoveries. In her TEDx talk, Crystle shares her own story of shifting from a state of burnout, chronic illness, and self-abandonment to greater ease, alignment, and empowerment. Crystle uses a somatic and relational approach in her private practice to help clients shift their stuck patterns. Through her speaking engagements, she hopes to educate others and encourage them to never give up, even when prospects seem bleak. And we're going to get to where you can find her later. So welcome to the show, Crystle Lampitt. We need to like one of those little things that goes, yay.
Yeah, we need the clap.
Yes. Yeah. All of the confetti, the whole 9 yards.
Yes. I'm sure there's sound effects I actually can do within this. I just need to figure it out. So
okay,
I'll work on
that's
that.
for you, your technology assignment for the year.
Got it.
Have you ever listened to did you guys watch Friends ever?
Oh yeah,
of course.
So I've got my little Friends I'll be there for you mug.
I see.
And
Nice.
I'm gonna listen to it without the laugh track. It's so weird.
So deadpan and weird.
Yeah.
Like everything becomes awkward.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a reason they do that. We probably should get on board with that. So I wonder if we sound like
we're not laughing at our own jokes all the time.
Yes. We do. We're our biggest fans. That's fine.
That's a really like I feel like a squirrel now because I grew up on laugh tracks. Everything told you what to do. They all told you how to feel on sitcoms and things like that. You should be sad. Oh, you should be excited. Ha 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 ha. Like you were told how to feel when you heard something. That's kind of an interesting segue for today. Isn't it? Yeah, a little bit. A little bit. So thanks for bringing it up. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to meet you guys.
Yes. So we would really like to start off with your story because we're very interested in personal stories because usually there's a thread that starts us somewhere and gets us to where we are. So we would love for our listeners to hear your story because it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I know. I think it's like especially in the helping profession, right? It's like something got us all here. And I definitely it wasn't a straight path. I would say this is my fourth full-time career. And I'm not that old. I'm 36. So I just had to
Okay.
bounce around a lot, and we'll see. Hopefully I'll stay with this one, but I grew up overseas, so I lived in Indonesia for most of my childhood. My mom is Indonesian, and um, it was a lot of chaos, moving around a lot, and my dad's job kind of took us everywhere, and I eventually landed in the middle of Kansas. So we're
Like
all here
Dorothy,
now.
like you're like Dorothy.
Yep.
Of
Go
all the places, right? You could
Right.
land.
go from like mountains and beaches to
Uh-huh.
Kansas.
Yeah.
Um, it was pretty funny. I thought it would be like Hollywood, because my only exposure to what the United States was like was actually the movie Clueless, which I still love to this day because Paul,
Oh boy.
how can you not love
Okay.
Paul Rudd? He's from Kansas. He's from Shawnee, where I live right now.
He's so
That's why
dreamy.
you're
He's so
there. That's
dreamy.
why
I
you
do like him.
Me too. I still tell him, and I'm like, if
Paul, get your ass on the show here. Come
no,
on.
I know.
All
He's
right.
wonderful. So I ended up here, had a lot, and it was fine. I mean, all things considered, we had to evacuate Indonesia actually. So we came from a background of a lot of strife. There was just a lot of political unrest going on. I actually was at a missionary school at the time, so they were persecuting anyone who was non-Muslim. Um, so it was just chaotic. And I think my nervous system really learned that this pace was normal, like to be going and working hard. And we lived around a lot of poverty. We were very lucky. We were actually considered, I'll never forget this, we were considered wealthy because we had a refrigerator.
Wow.
Um, and so, the town that we lived in, the village that we lived in, some of our neighbors didn't even have electricity. I mean, this is decades ago. And so I think my system just kind of learned like this is the pace. You got to work hard at life. And moving to the States was like, you're gonna have to work harder than everyone else because of your skin color. And
Did you
also,
know that? I mean, was that something that you came here knowing? Did somebody tell you that, or was that just like
no,
common knowledge? Or
no one told me this, not directly. Well, I can remember one bully who did.
oh,
Um, but I would say it was more internalized. You do get a certain message. There's obviously racism, but then there's also skin color stratification, which
Yep.
I mean in Indonesia is huge. So I'm considered a darker skinned Indonesian, and everything there is light skin lightening products, right? Here you want to be tan, everyone wants to be tan and look like they just came back from vacation. And in Indonesia, you want to be white. You don't want to look like a laborer in the rice fields, right? Because
Yeah.
that means you're a lower class. And so, I mean, it was like everywhere. It was kind of a lose-lose, right? Like there, I was not light enough. Here, I was like tan, but it also wasn't going to necessarily work for me, being brown skinned. And so I kind of internalized it and just decided unconsciously, well, I'm just going to have to work my ass off, right? I'm just going to have to be
Yeah.
good enough, and I'm going to have to show them. And so I landed in, surprise, surprise, some careers that were maybe not the best for my mental health. But one area where I could kind of find maybe a little more acceptance was actually modeling. So I worked as a model for several years and kind of led a double life for a while I was going to college. And I was just tall enough that I could work in Asia. And so
Ah,
I did that for a while, and I
okay.
was back here to finish my studies. And then eventually that led into television. So I worked at the local news station here for almost 8, 9 years, and ended up hosting a morning show, doing a newscast, doing like three people's jobs basically. So talk
mhm.
about burnout. It was really chaotic. But it was, for all intents and purposes, like the success story, right? Like when I think of the American dream, and before moving here, when I saw what people had, I mean, I remember one of the first things that I was so surprised by was just how manicured people's lawns are. And, I'm in the suburbs. So I was like, wow, like look at how green the grass is. And medians, like roads were organized. And I remember just thinking like, wow, this is it. Like we're here, we've made it. Um, And so I always kind of had this sense of like, well, I need to work harder to be able to earn staying here. And I'm an American citizen. So again, it wasn't even like that was, no one
Mhm.
told me these things, right? But
Right.
somewhere, like you get these ideas. Um,
Mhm.
so I did work at the station for a really long time until about, let's see, my mid late 20s. I started to get all these sort of mysterious ailments, and eventually got diagnosed with hypothyroidism and autoimmune diseases. So actually my hair started to fall out in these huge chunks. I had these bald spots. Meanwhile, I'm hosting a morning show where I'm on air every day. Um, so they diagnosed me with alopecia areata, and then after that also Sjogren's syndrome and psoriasis. So I started to get these rashes, and my salivary glands and my tear ducts don't always work properly. And so I'm just like, what is going on? I'm in my 20s. You think that's supposed to be this great time of life. You're certainly not aging, right? And so
Right.
but that is when most people get diagnosed with autoimmune illnesses, and I think a big factor was the burnout. And so I did all the things, went to the doctor, went to holistic practitioners. I did everything under the sun. Like, I think if you would have told me, like, "Hey, Crystal, jump backwards 10 times before bed, and that's gonna cure everything," I would have done it. I
Mm.
was just, like, desperate for
Yep.
somebody to help. And so kind of short story long, that's how I started to look into somatic work, working with the body, also mental health, because I realized a lot of what I was doing was coming from fear and desperation. And there's a whole host of physiological responses that are occurring in your body when you're approaching your health through the lens of fear and desperation, right? And so that
Yep.
body connection was huge. And I'm happy to say most of my physical symptoms, anyway, are in remission. So it's been years to get here, but it's a lot better. I just had to change everything about my life. No big deal. But
Yeah, I
No
was
big
gonna
deal,
say
and I went
yeah.
back to school and got a master's degree and then
Yep.
subsequent licensing, and,
Mhm.
when you talk about, like, some of the careers that I've had are just not good for my mental health, I'm like, "Yeah, this one."
Yeah, I mean,
that's true. That's so funny, right?
so real.
Funny, but not funny, like, it's
Yeah.
funny, but not funny, but yeah. So you need a shirt that says "Personally victimized by
I
my
do.
You
neurotypical."
do. I was gonna say she needs the shirt. Like,
I feel
this is
personally victimized by my
I'm curious to know, can you share just a little bit when you say somatic work, where did that start for you? What were you doing for yourself?
First of all, I wanna backtrack that. What is somatic work for our
There you go.
listeners
All
who
right.
don't know
Sure.
what it is? Yes.
Yeah, so somatic work kind of became popularized through a type of trauma therapy called somatic experiencing. It was created by Peter Levine. He really started looking into this and creating it, formulating it in the 70s. So it's been around for several decades now. And he and also Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, they were just really huge in scientifically finding evidence for that mind body connection. And so, with somatic work, especially when it comes to treating trauma, we are working directly with the autonomic nervous system and really helping. In my case, right, I needed to learn how to track my body, how to track my nervous system. What happens when we've been living with chronic stress or we have a lot of unresolved trauma? It's like our brain is on high alert all the time. So when I was saying, growing up overseas, I think my brain just kind of thought these things were normal.
Mm.
And so somatic work is really just working with the nervous system, helping your body to understand and access more regulation, more of that parasympathetic rest and digest, while also completing any potential incomplete or unprocessed trauma that might be showing up in repeated what we call survival responses. So, if you have a chronic flight response or you have a chronic freeze response, you might be feeling really dissociated, really spacey, or really angsty all the time. So it's a different way it's a still mental health, right? But it's like mental health is really physical health and vice versa. Like
Mhm.
they're not as separate as we like to make them sometimes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the time.
All
Yeah.
the
Like, I wanna say, like, all the time, like,
yeah.
your head is connected to your body all the time.
The brain is in your body, right? Like
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and so that was essentially what got me here was I think first, when I think anyone gets a diagnosis, right? The first thing you're going to do is like, okay, well, let me talk to my doctor about this. And I tried the medications that they want to put you on for whether it's autoimmune or hypothyroidism, and I had Synthroid, and I tried these different things. And I was lucky that they didn't have any adverse effects, but they also weren't really helping. And so that was sort of my first stop, right? Is like, okay, well, and I love my primary care. So I was like, I really trust her. I think she's going to lead me in the right direction. And I was also pretty young. So I was just like, I don't know.
Mhm.
Sure, let's try it.
Yeah.
Tried that. And after, maybe 6 months or a year or so, not seeing much improvement. And also I wasn't, to be honest, the most consistent about taking the medications. I was kind of like, I don't really know if this is it. And I felt awful inside all the time because I was like, why is my body betraying me? What am
Mhm.
I doing wrong? So then I went down the rabbit hole of these really strict protocols, right? So I eliminated like everything. I did the autoimmune protocol. I eliminated sugar, dairy, all grains, which I'm Indonesian. We eat rice like all day, every day, right? Like
Ah.
not not okay. Also
Yeah.
We
not
villainize rice over here, I have to
Yeah.
say. Like,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
rice is a villain. Mhm.
Yeah, we do, and which that idea, right, goes, like, biologically against your body as well. So I just wanna throw that out there, right? Like, you tried an intervention or asked to do an intervention or part of an intervention that went completely against
totally.
your
Yeah.
genetics and how you are biologically hardwired. So
Yeah,
that's a I don't know, I just want to throw that in there because that's a very interesting thought, right? Because a lot of people are seeking that do a lot of those really strict diet changes for, and I'm not saying that's not helpful, right? For people that have thyroid issues or Hashimoto's or all these things, right? Like I'm not gonna say that, but we just removed something that actually might be very imperative for your functioning biologically.
totally. Well, and this is the importance of culturally competent care,
Right.
right?
Yes.
You have to
This
know.
this is just a different layer to it
It is,
because
it completely is, right? Like, talk
yeah.
about multiracial transplant. That sticks
Yeah.
out when you said that in your bio, and I'm thinking, "Okay, so here's an intervention that goes completely against how she's genetically wired."
Yeah, but you read all these testimonials of,
Sure.
oh, working so well for Susie
Absolutely.
in Texas. So
Yep.
okay,
Yep.
so I tried all those things, and I will say everything helped in its own way. If
Mhm.
nothing else, just to give me good information about what wasn't going to be the right step for me, right? So even trying medications and seeing that it didn't provide enough of a
Yeah.
support for me was sort of like, okay, well, what's next then? Let's try this. And I did work with an MD, sort of like an integrative MD, out in California, who then prescribed sort of like a supplement plan. We talked about diet, we did all sorts of things, and it was nice to have a little bit more time speaking with an MD, because that is usually, as pretty short
Mhm.
and sweet, maybe 10 minutes to talk to your doctor. And so I did feel there was a little bit more care and attention. But again, I was still doing these extremely restrictive things for my body. And on the one hand, it was good. My digestion was better. Like, go figure, you eat more vegetables, your stomach works better. Right? Like, no shit, right?
Mhm.
So it was still helpful in some ways,
Mhm.
but in other ways, I was more stressed out than ever because I was getting into this orthorexia where I was terrified to eat anything. And then I wasn't
Uh,
as much because then I wouldn't go to a restaurant because I'd be afraid about, well, what's in the food, and they're not going to have what I need, which is, more than gluten free. I needed like grain free, sugar free. And so then it just had this really deleterious effect on my mental health, where I started realizing like my world is getting smaller and smaller. And like, yeah, I'm moving more and I'm eating healthier, but I'm terrified of everything and I'm stressed out about everything. And so it's like just cortisol and adrenaline pumping through my veins
yeah.
all the time. And finally, I think I realized something has to change here, because even though I'm doing these things that appear to be healthy, I feel worse than ever. I was still symptomatic. And then I had this layer of, depression and just misery on top of it.
Yeah.
And so that's what eventually, and I mean, like, I know you were kind of joking, but I mean, I did go back to school and I put myself through more burnout. I was still
Yeah.
hosting the morning show while I was in school. The
Yeah.
pandemic hit while I
Of
was in
course
the
you were.
so, I
Of
mean,
course you were.
it was a wild ride for a while.
We all do this shit, by the way, just so
This
you
is not new.
know. Like,
How do you
this
think
is
I
like,
knew
I'm
that?
sitting here just going, "Yep, check, check, check,
Yeah.
check, check."
Mhm.
Of course. Yeah.
Yes, it's the, plight of the high achiever,
Yeah, it is.
well, it's also the plight of the, I'm not enough person,
Mhm.
right? Like, I'll never be enough, I'm not enough, um, and I think there's that drive for a lifetime to solve that,
Yeah,
right? Like, if I just do this next big thing, then I
yeah.
will be enough. If I just help enough people, then I will be enough, you know? If I just do this, then I'll be enough. And I wanted to point something out because, you were talking about changing your diet and all these things that became super restrictive, which is something that I don't necessarily believe in.
Mhm.
Unless it has to be, unless you've got a disease state like celiac, then you're going to have to be super restrictive. Um, but I I think part of it wasn't just the restrictive nutritional stuff, it was the beliefs about it, right? When we're talking about self-sabotaging, limiting beliefs, I think this is where I want to put that together because
Mhm.
I don't want people to be like, well, she tried all these nutritional things and they didn't help her. And I'm like, well, the stress came from the thoughts around it, like the fear and, the
Mhm.
limiting things. And that's the cortisol stress that you were talking about. And so when Jen and I talk about the pillars of mental health, eat, sleep, move, meditate, the meditate part is the emotional pieces of all of this and what we say to ourselves or don't say to ourselves. That was the part that seemed to be maybe missing, or amped up,
Tot
right? Like negatively amped up, despite doing all the other things I'm air quoting right.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
correctly.
Yeah.
That part was the missing piece or the piece that just kept getting amped and amped and amped and amped, which is hard. I being restrictive is hard, right?
Totally.
So how did you find resolution in that piece for yourself then in the piece of self-sabotage? How did you find resolution or haven't you?
Yeah. Nope, still figuring it out. No.
Well, I mean, I am.
That's fair.
I'm freaking 55 years old and I'm still
I
figuring it
know.
out.
No, totally. And as far as good enough piece, right? That will
Yeah,
maybe always be a work in progress.
maybe. Mhm.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's that everything is a relationship. Everything is how am I relating to this protocol? And if you're doing it in a way that it feels good and it feels supportive, and you're like, yeah, I'm going to cut out grains and I'm going to eat these vegetables and these other things that feel really good for me. And this feels really nourishing to me. And you're affirming to yourself, and your body is
Mhm.
showing you that this feels good and this feels safe. um, that's probably you're going to have a totally different outcome, right? But if you're doing it in the way that I was, which was fear and,
Mhm.
perfectionism, because that's the other piece, right? Another part of my strategy is perfectionism. So I couldn't even have one grain of rice, I mean, it was so intense. And in my case, I wasn't aware of my trauma history. Like, obviously now talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, like the way, the environments we were living in. And I have a whole host of childhood shit that I'm like, oh, but I wouldn't have until I got into this work. I just thought, well, I'm functioning because
Yeah.
that's how we see things, right? Well,
Yeah, that means you're fine.
you're
Yeah. Mhm.
fine.
Yeah.
So I would kind of say like, well, I went through hardship, but I'm resilient and it's fine. Everything's fine. So once I kind of became more aware of, oh, trauma has something to do with why I am the way that I am and why my nervous system operates in this way, then everything kind of made sense. It was like, oh, okay, so your perfectionism around the way that you're eating, the extreme
Mhm.
hypervigilance around
Sure.
doing things just right. And so somatic work, and really my very first training was actually in NARM. It stands for Neuroaffective Relational Model. And it was so mind-blowing because it is both somatic, so, bottom up includes the body in the conversation. It is both bottom up and top down. So there is also the cognitive piece to it. And being someone who likes research and likes things to make sense, I needed some buy-in still.
Sure.
It was helpful to understand attachment dynamics, the impact on your physiology when you have a childhood that might have had some chaos or ups and downs or neglect. I think neglect is actually the sneakiest one that most of us are not aware of. And so understanding that, okay, so not only am I completely disconnected from my body, I don't understand what my needs are. I didn't even know you were allowed to have needs. I remember in one of my very first I think it was in my internship. Somebody had this list of human needs. It was a worksheet that, you could give to clients. Like I'm like an intern by this point. And it was a list of human needs. And it was like basic things that you would expect, like air, food, water, and I'm like, oh yeah. I'm
Had
like,
those.
check,
Mhm.
awesome. Food, I'm great. And then there were other things like connection, support,
And you're
joy.
like,
I was like, huh? I was like, "Those are needs? Those are
right.
luxuries."
Yeah, those
Those
are
are
luxuries.
luxuries.
That's an
Yeah.
add-on a la carte. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yep. Mhm.
That's concierge service right
It
there.
is. It is.
I
That's
asked
fancy
myself,
shit.
like,
Yeah.
and I remember, and it sounds so ridiculous now,
Yeah.
but at the time, so one of the big puzzle pieces for me was I was in a string of abusive relationships. So talk about connection and
Mm.
support. No, my system was on high alert because I didn't understand. I never knew what shape my partner would be in when he came home. And
Mhm.
so that was adding to the hypervigilance, right? So I had actual environmental reasons to be fearful, but then I also had this internal patterning where my system was like, this is what is normal. This is what you're used to. So yeah, being in a toxic partnership, totally. Not
Mhm.
getting your needs met, that's fine. This is how it is for everybody, right?
Mhm.
And I wouldn't have seen that as self-sabotage or low self-esteem. If you would have asked me, I would have said I have tons of confidence. I host a morning show every day and I introduce myself to 30 people a week that I was interviewing and talking on live TV. So I just
Mhm.
never would have seen any of that as self-sabotage, or really I call it self-protection, right? I mean, self-sabotage, the body and the brain are not trying to hurt you. They're really not, as much as it can feel that way, especially when you have chronic illness that your body is
Yeah.
betraying you. It's your brain and your body doing their damnedest, right? They're trying their hardest to keep you safe, to protect you, and to signal you. But you have to, ideally,
Yeah.
I try to teach my clients to, like, have you heard the saying, like, a feather brick semi? First listen for when something is a feather, like a little feather tickle. And if you don't hear or notice the symptom when it's a light feather touch, it's going to hit you again as a brick. You're going to get a brick in the face. You're going to get a louder signal. And then if you don't listen to the brick, you're going to get a semi, right? And you're going to feel like you got hit by a truck.
See, you are like the second guest in the last
I was just
month.
gonna say, Susie
We
said the
just
same thing,
we
the 3
just had another
times.
person talk about, yeah,
Yes.
how illness will knock 3 times, and by the
Yep.
Oh,
3rd, you're
really? Nice.
Mhm.
but it's about listening is exactly what you're talking about, and the idea that the body is going to continue to protect and try to protect you, right? But I think that that's something that, we miss a lot are the subtle signals. And you know what? They aren't that fucking subtle. Like when you're talking about what you went through when it comes to the autoimmune pieces, right? And your alopecia and going through, like, if that's not the body's way of telling you stop, figure it out, then I don't know what is, right? Like these are the body is going
The
to actually
problem is
tell
that the
you.
the alopecia was on the back of your head in your blind spot, so you couldn't see it, right? If you saw it, if it was here, then maybe earlier you
Mhm.
would have caught something, maybe, but it was in your blind spot. Mhm.
It was still enough. I think I was lucky though, right? Because it was still enough. It hit me right in my vanity, right? It was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
oh, this will
Yep.
get her to pay attention because modeling,
Truth.
right? I mean,
Right.
modeling is all about appearance and then
Yeah.
being on TV, right? Being on air. And so I was lucky that it was back here so I could do I did clip-ins to cover it up.
Mhm.
Um
Oh, sure.
but it was just enough. It was still enough. I think that would have been too
Well, that
much.
would have freaked you out. That would have been your semi truck.
I was like,
Yes.
maybe a little bit nicer. Maybe this was
Yeah.
the right.
Mhm.
But it did. I mean, it worked, right? It got my
Mm-hmm.
attention. And then I started realizing, like, I haven't been feeling good for a while. What's going on with my
Yeah.
digestion? What's going on with my energy
Mm-hmm.
level? What's going on
Mhm.
with my skin?
Yeah.
I started to get these rashes and outbreaks.
Yeah.
You need to listen to the episode of Dr. Ebony Cornish, which will be
Okay.
the episode right before this one airs. So I think you're gonna like that one. She's
She's
good.
telling the guests to listen to the
I
episodes
am,
with the
like, it
other
was
guests. Like,
so
this is
good. It
scary.
was all about
Scary.
autoimmune diseases, but,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted to bring up something because it was kinda sitting with me when you said, I was basically outperforming yourself daily, as a TV anchor and interviewing people and all these things, but at home, you were underperforming, interpersonally, and I look at that now because I used to do the same damn shit, like, I would outperform at work, but this is well before I was married. I would underperform interpersonally, like choosing men that were terrible, like just
Mhm.
absolutely shit show of humans, you know? And I believe now that that was an extension, if you want to look at it as a symptom of
Yeah.
not being enough playing out in my interpersonal life. And I was trying to overcompensate for that by professionally doing more, being more, becoming more, doing the next big thing, you know? So
Mhm.
I feel like people operate in those constructs that are in the same affliction, right? Like we professionally outperform everyone.
Mhm.
Interpersonally is where the damage is or where the symptomology lays. And once we can consolidate those two things, right, life becomes more equal.
Yeah.
More, I don't want to say balanced, I hate that word,
More
but
aligned.
more in line. Yeah, aligned. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good word. More aligned, you know.
Yeah.
There was a concept that you had that just keeps coming up over and over, and I don't know if it's a new buzzword or what, but you mentioned this. I don't know if it was in your bio or somewhere that I read about personal agency.
Mm.
She said the word agency. Jen and I have been using that word now, you know, for a while because it's so profound. How does someone, in your opinion, or how did you reclaim your agency? Because again, all the things that you did were kind of outsourced by somebody else. They told you what to do, right? Like,
Mhm.
do this restrictive diet, do this thing, do that, do this, do this. How does one reclaim their agency when they're in that state of
Mm.
desperation to, I guess, reclaim their own health, and we give it up to everybody else. Like, give me the answers, everybody. And so I don't know if you can talk about that at all. Yeah, if you'd
Yeah.
like to.
Well, and I think this is part of why I came into this field is I think therapy was the one of the first spaces where I saw an EMDR therapist, and she was somebody who started to ask me, "Well, what do you think? How does that feel for you?" And so I actually see this as one of the signs of healing, if you will, or signs of recovery is moving from what I call other referencing to self-referencing. And so when we have learned for so long that what's going to keep me safe is making other people happy, presenting a certain way, maybe in my case, people pleasing, perfectionism, these are going to be the things that keep me safe because in some senses they do, especially if that's a childhood thing or, this is how you survived your family of origin or this is what the world taught you about who you are and where you belong, right? As a woman who is like non-white or half white, what did I learn about how to survive and stay safe? And so agency is huge. And therapy was huge for me to start asking myself those questions about, what do you need? And like I said, like looking at a list of like, here are some examples of needs that all humans have. One that destigmatized it for me because then I was like, oh, I'm allowed to have needs and I'm allowed to disagree with some of the fuckery that's going on in my life right now. Like, I don't have to be in a relationship with someone who yells at me and calls me names and gets violent. Like, I don't have to do that. Wait a minute. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So it was
Yeah.
kind of speaking of being gaslit, right? Like, I had believed and I believe internalized messages that you get what you get and you're happy with it. And this is how all relationships are. I really
Yeah.
remember thinking like this is what was normal. And truly I just didn't know. And so really starting to find these sources within friendships. I had a few friends who I think social support, well, the research also shows this, right? Social support is one of the hugest protective against most mental health conditions or trauma and any of the things that we deal with as humans. And so I had luckily a few friends who had lives that I was like, okay, they're functioning. They have healthy relationships. So I think finding those people in your life who
You
are,
think. You
yeah,
think.
I think, yeah,
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
observe,
Had to throw that in there. Mhm.
or at least they appear to be better than how I feel day to day, right? There was a level of when I first understood what secure attachment is, I was like, oh, that's a thing. You can feel safe in a relationship and vulnerable in a relationship, and you can speak openly about your insecurities and your fears. Like I had a friend who would talk to her partner about stuff she was going through. And I was like, what? You tell your partner that? Like, doesn't that turn him off? Isn't he going to abandon you now? She was
Yeah.
like, no, he tells me his insecurities. I was like, what? I mean, it just was like, it felt so mind blowing. And
Yeah.
so when you start to find, however you find that, right, whether it's a friend or a distant relative or a therapist, I mean, therapy is one of the first exposures to a safe, secure, hopefully,
Mhm.
relationship. And it started to invite this sense of, well, how does something feel in my body? And honestly, lots of EMDR. I mean, I did a lot of EMDR on my trauma. I did do some somatic experiencing, and NARM was probably one of the pieces that blew it wide open for me, was understanding
Mhm.
attachment and understanding how badly we need connection for survival, but also how badly we need to be able to be our own person, in that connection, disconnection dance that we're all doing as humans. And without making anything bad or wrong. I think we get really stuck in these binaries, right? Of like, this is the one right way to do it. It's not, there's not one right way, but I do think you can start to find in your circle. I mean, I even would use books, examples from books. I remember reading about attachment, reading Gottman's work and understanding what secure attachment was. Like he would just tell stories of examples. And I'd be like, is that really possible? So I think first you kind of need a little bit of hope though, right? Like you need a little sense of
Mhm.
the fact that maybe there is a different way. And so however you can get that, ideally through relationship of some kind, is
Mhm.
the first step, and
Yeah. You talk a lot about narcissistic abuse.
mm,
That's something that has popped in a few of the things that you post. You've got that on your website too. For you, the intrigue that you have, does that come from a personal space based
mhm,
off of things that you have been through in your life?
mhm. Yeah, totally. So, and narcissistic abuse is sneaky because from the outside, no one else sees it. In fact, people who will say, high conflict personalities or pathological personalities, which again, trauma. I work
Mhm.
with NPD, I work with narcissism. I believe we all have narcissistic parts. I certainly do. Like whatever you want to call it. It's all coming from, like, it makes sense. If you really look at it, it makes sense. And there's something about being okay with that type of relationship that begs the question, like, okay, what is happening in me? And whenever
Mhm.
you see a pattern, right? So for me, in my case, it wasn't like I just had like one off, like one bad relationship. I had
Yeah.
like three in a row that
Yeah.
I was like, what in the actual fuck? Like, how are all of these other people apparently, right? I know it's not all rainbows and sunshine with what people present on social media, but I really do see people who
Yeah.
seemingly had like at least safe relationships, and I just couldn't figure it out.
Mhm.
Like something is and then of course I did the shame spiral. Something is deeply wrong with me. And
Yeah.
then I understood more about complex PTSD. I understood, oh, some of this is again,
Reenactment of trauma.
Right.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And but sneaky, right? Because so
Mhm.
it was more of a neglect situation where while we were always safe, or we would be removed from dangerous situations to get to safety, right? Like I ended up living in 7 different countries by the time I was 12, and had gone to like 5 different schools, and we were always removed from unsafe situations. So when I thought back on my history, I was like, but we were fine, right? but it was the emotional piece, right? Like there was never a conversation about like, how are you doing with all this? Like,
Yeah.
how did that feel for you or what's going on? So I did not have an organized self. I did not have a sense of self. I just kind of went with, and I think this is what we do growing up because there's no other choice. You take what you get and
Mhm.
you get what you get. Um, and until you kind of understand that and can really look at it without shame, without blame, without this sense of something is deeply wrong with me that I need to internalize, then you can actually start accepting and having, forming that sense of self and really realizing. I mean, I got to the point where I was like, you know what? If I really am broken and this is just what's meant for me is I'm going to be single. And I was like, actually fine with that. I genuinely was like, unless I can truly connect with someone who treats me well, who is able to be vulnerable, who can be honest with themselves. And it took a while for me to be really honest with myself, right? Because there is
Right.
something very vulnerable about being perceived and being vulnerable in relationship. And so it took so much untangling. And so I had to deconstruct like everything I thought I knew. Um, and then finally it kind of became clear, oh, this is not a character flaw. This isn't something's wrong with me and something's wrong with them and they're all bad and I'm all good. It's just not that simple. It's all of our unhealed wounds are in relationship with all of our partners' unhealed wounds or unhealed parts. So these parts are going to do this little dance as I believe an invitation to look at what still needs work. Um, and luckily now it's just not as unsafe. So
I
for me,
wanna
Yeah.
I have some questions here because and you may not have the answers. And I may be incorrect, and you can tell me that. Because as you're sharing your story of being 12 and moving to all these countries when you're 12, I'm guessing it was because your parents wanted safety, physical safety. Um, and so emotional safety wasn't part of the conversation because physical safety
Trumps.
is, yeah, it trumps
Yeah.
everything.
Trumps it.
It trumps
For sure.
everything. So in your parents' minds and raising, they're like, we
yeah,
are doing the best thing we can to keep our kids physically safe, as we move along. So I'm thinking if you would have stayed in the environment that you were in originally as a child, none of this emotional awakening would have ever happened. It was because you came to the United States that we start talking about. I'm just going to, historically look at Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, right?
yeah,
Like, so if you look at that, like the basic safety stuff is on the bottom. That's where your parents were operating from all the time, you
Yeah.
know, all the time. And so now you're working up the self actualization tower here, and you're like, oh, wow. Like, I can see that there's so much more
More. Mhm.
to the lived human experience than just, excuse me, than just living in the bottom, safety of person,
mm,
right? And resources piece of things,
absolutely. Yeah.
right? So this is real, like the cultural melding
Mhm,
of your history versus now American culture looking at emotions and
Mhm.
the self-actualized person, right? So, okay, because I'm sitting here over here going, is
totally.
that what this is? Like, is that what I'm hearing? Is that what I'm, you
Yeah.
know, yes. And okay, so that makes sense to me. I didn't really have a question. I was just like, am I
Yeah.
thinking through this correctly here? Like, mhm.
She's totally being a therapist right now. Like that
No,
was a
I'm just
total
trying to
therapist moment.
understand. Like, I'm really just trying to understand.
Exactly. That's what you're doing. This is what you're doing. And I just, this is good.
Back,
Oh.
right? Right. And it's a huge like, isn't that also part of reconfiguring, your narrative and your understanding is
Yeah.
like, I can now have so much appreciation, but I needed to process all the other shit first, right? Like I
Yeah.
still needed to understand how this impacted me, even with good intentions, right? I always differentiate intent versus impact. Even with the
Yeah.
best of intentions, the impact can still be, and this is where understanding your brain is so helpful. The impact can still be, yeah, but that was hard for me, even though, yeah, we got to
Yes.
physical safety.
Yes. No,
Yes.
I really appreciate that, the
Mm,
intention versus the impact, because I do think that we're living in a culture today of just impact. You
Yeah.
know, my parents were wrong. They should never have done this because the impact to me was this. And I'm like, but intention brings context as well. You can't heal. And this goes for you, for me, for my parents, for your parents, whatever. You can't heal trauma if you're still fighting in the war,
Mhm.
right? So we literally have to pull ourselves out of the war
Mhm.
in order to start even
Mm-hmm.
looking at the trauma, right?
Yeah.
That happened to us in the war that we didn't know we were fighting,
Right.
right? Like
Right. Yeah.
we had no idea.
And I got to add something onto this. Crystle, you said something that I think is really, and you're probably I think some of us are so used to saying this, not only like as therapists, and working with individuals, like especially, I don't know, this comes out really like naturally out of my mouth a lot. And I have to put myself in check to go, okay, wait, what does that actually mean when I just said that, Jen? Because you just said something about how it makes sense. It
Mhm.
makes sense now when I look back on what I've been through, that I am going through what I'm going through now, right? Like, talk about a completely trauma informed approach to most things in life, right? Like, it makes sense you are in the position that you are in. We say this to our clients all the time too. Like, if when you look back, what you just shared with us about your history, right? In the multiracial transplant and what that means for you, it makes sense that you would be in this position. You just said that, and it triggered me to think about and I'm kind of going, you said the brain, and I'm kind of going to the central nervous system here. So when I'm thinking about where you grew up and what you were exposed to, our central nervous systems don't develop right fully until we're like in our early 20s, right? And so if the central nervous system's function, right, is to receive that sensory information, right, process it, send the signals out, right, to the body, and collect information, motor, right, like send signals to our muscles, our organs, right, cognitive, learning, memory, this is all these things, right? Thinking about how stunted that was for you, never being right, and I'm using some absolute words here, but probably never being in an optimal state where there wasn't something constantly that never lets you get to any parasympathetic places ever, right? It makes sense.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
and then you put yourself where you are now. And I asked you a question about narcissistic abuse, right? And we think about from just the functioning of a central nervous system space and continuing those patterns on, and the body giving us these signals, whether it's the alopecia, right? Or the autoimmune issues, right? Like, it gives us all these signals constantly. And now in hindsight, you can go back because you've hit some of these self-actualization places, right? Where purpose is there now. Internal sense of agency has been found at a level that wasn't there before. It's almost like, does it make sense for you?
Mhm. Mhm.
Does it make sense now? Like, it's and if it does, then what a great place to be.
Yeah.
Like, what a great place to just sit in when it's like, fuck, this isn't my fault.
Oh, totally. It's huge, right? Is
Like,
understanding the brain, understanding environmental failures, environmental stressors, and really when you look at it from a psychobiological perspective and an environmental, right? Biopsychosocial is what we say in my field, and it does, and yay! And also, isn't it a congruent response to be on high alert when you're living in a
right.
situation that
As
is
it should be, right? Like, this is for you to operate differently doesn't quite make sense. You'd be kind of an anomaly within all of this to be able to completely, or you're just completely dissociated forever.
Yes.
Um, I mean, I would question that too with people, right? And not that we have to pathologize everything, and at the same time, that I think this makes sense too, just given what you've all shared, right?
Yeah, not until now, would it really be. And that is, getting to a place where you can understand first the external changes that might need to happen. And it wouldn't make sense for me to be able to do this work if I was still in those environments, if I was still in an
Right,
unhealthy relationship.
right,
But both and, right? Often when we shift the internal relationship to the self, we can then start creating some external changes as well, and vice versa.
right.
But we need both, and it has to feel at least a little bit safe to connect with the body and understand sensations and needs. But the more I think there is an understanding of your body is trying to help you and it's not betraying you. It's not trying to anyway, right? And a lot of these responses are so congruent. That takes so much shame out of it. And also, I think it reduces some of that fear and intensity. And honestly, my continued work is helping my system to learn that it is no longer in those situations. So I'm continuously doing my own somatic work, accessing more parasympathetic. And I think there's always going to be some, residual stuff from there, especially earlier in childhood, right? With what we know about adverse childhood experiences. But yeah, understanding it's like, oh, your brain's on your side, your body's trying to help you. It's just a game changer. Makes such a huge difference in how we relate to ourselves.
There's one last quote, and this is the quote that I had said off camera that I was going to bring in, and I think it's a great place here. You had said in something, no, it was in your TED
TED
Talk,
Talk.
yeah, that your mental health symptoms, looking at them as a sign of our own humanity rather than a sign of pathology. And I loved that because we pathology fails us, right? It's where we stop. Okay, so
Yep.
I've got a diagnosis, I've got a label, I've got pathology, period.
Done.
Done, and so I'm like, no, we have to look at this as this is part of our humanity. This is part of our lived experience. This is what our body is designed to do, actually, you know? And the signaling and all the stuff that Jen was just talking about a few moments ago, this is what our body is built for. But for some reason, we get stuck in the pathology, and that's just it. I have, PTSD or some mental health diagnosis, and that is my life forever, instead of the agency that we were just talking about. Like, okay, so this happened to me. This is my impact, of life. And now I have a responsibility to self to develop my own agency here and figure out what to do from here. So anyway, I don't even know if that was your intention when you said that, or I think it was just written as part of a title or something or whatever. But what do you make of that now hearing it at the end of the show?
That feels good to hear. I actually forgot I said that.
It's very epic. So you might want to brand the shit out of that, girl.
Yes, I think
I'm
you
just saying,
a t-shirt.
put it somewhere.
God, if I could, that really does encapsulate, I think, what I hope my message can be to people is that there is hope and that there's so much wisdom internally that has gotten covered up by life, by stressors, by what I call adaptive survival strategies, right? A lot of this work is not so much about let's add and make you better and add things to your life to make everything better and you need to be a new and improved version of yourself. It's really what can we subtract? What obstacles, what strategies have gotten in the way of and are covering up this innate wisdom that you have? And so when we do this work, we get to slowly peel back the layers and hopefully reconnect with that wisdom in the body. And I mean, honestly, I wouldn't do this if I hadn't had my own personal experiences with it. So I get to say, I really feel like living proof of that.
Love it. Well, I would like to thank you for being on the show.
Yes.
This is our second show of the new year. So welcome to 2025. That's right.
Get it.
That's right. And if you have stuck around with us this far, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and send us your Gaslit Truth at the Gaslit Truth Podcast. I can't even talk, at the Gaslit Truth
You can do
Podcast
it. You can do it.
at gmail.com.
That's fantastic. And where can people find you, Crystle?
Yeah, feel free to check out my website, clwellnesskc.com. And then I'm also at Crystle Lampitt on Instagram.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It'll all be linked in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Crystle.
Thanks for having me.